Good evening, good afternoon from Crete. Welcome to the Alexandria Center for Hellenistic Studies and Institute for Mediterranean Studies Neoplatonic lectures. We are greatly honored that our speaker today is Professor Mark Edwards, who is going to talk on Plotinus and the Gnostics. Please keep your microphones off during the talk. We will be able to turn them on again for the discussion. There will be a handout which I will share in a moment through chat. Mark Edwards is a professor of early Christian studies in the Faculty of Theology and Religion in the University of Oxford, and since 1993 he has been an official student, that is a tutorial fellow in theology in Christ Church in Oxford. He is the author or editor of more than 20 books and of around 250 articles or book chapters. His books include Origen Against Plato, Catholicity and Heresy in the Early Church, Image, Word and God in the Early Christian Centuries, Religions of the Constantine Empire, and Aristotle and Early Christian Thought in 2019. As in a way I have been his student, I would like to say that Mark is a loving teacher, and his students will know what I mean. And he is also a great and very generous and supportive friend. We met because of Porphyry. So I have always thought that what Evnapius says about Longinus perfectly applies to Mark as well, that he is a living library and a walking museum, spanning very different fields, from Plotinus and systematic theology to modern philosophy, and from Greek and Homer to modern Greek poetry, and even to the Oxford Inklings, the literary circle of John Tolkien and Clive Lewis, among others. So Mark, thank you very much for accepting the invitation, for the honor and for the support, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Irene, and thank you to everyone for coming and for the invitation. So I've chosen as my subject tonight what I actually did as my doctorate, the treatise of Plotinus, which is commonly entitled Against the Gnostics, Enneads 2.9. This is a work which is significant both for classicists and for students of early Christianity. Among Plotinus's treatises, it's the 33rd in chronological order of composition. As most of you will be aware, I take it the Enneads, the 54 treatises which represent the thought of Plotinus, were put together by his pupil Porphyry in an order which represents Porphyry's own idea of how Plotinus's philosophy should be read, but they don't reflect the order in which the works were actually composed. So although this is Enneads 2.9, therefore the 18th of 54 treatises in order of redaction, it's the 33rd in order of composition. And many scholars have thought that it represents a watershed in the thought of Plotinus, perhaps a crisis when he finally broke with former fellow students of Ammonius Saccas, when perhaps he also broke with the teaching of Numenius of Apamea, 2nd century Platonist, of whom I shall speak a bit later. It's also believed by many scholars to be the fourth in a kind of magnum opus to which Robert Harder gave the name of the Großschrift. And those who believe in the Großschrift would say that this is the place where one should go if one wants a single systematic digest of the thought of Plotinus. Whether that's true or not, it's certainly a very important text for anyone who's interested in Plotinus's understanding of providence or the question of evil, since he's writing against people who believe the world to be radically evil in its origin. As far as students of early Christianity are concerned, this is a particularly interesting text because it's probably the only pagan witness to the existence of a Christian movement to which modern scholars give the name Gnosticism. And it is indeed entitled by Porphyry himself, Against the Gnostics. So among other things, it bears witness to the currency of the term gnostikoi among pagans as well as among Christians. And it also bears witness to the fact that this term was applied to people who were regarded by themselves as Christians, even if as heretics. It shows us, therefore, what was at issue between Plotinus and at least a certain group of Christians. Since many historians of early Christianity think of Platonism and Gnosticism as both world-denying philosophies, and they contrast Platonism and Gnosticism with the world-affirming philosophy of Catholic or Orthodox Christianity, it's interesting from a theologian's point of view to see how Plotinus differentiates himself from the Gnostics and shows his position to be less world-denying in this sense than that of the Gnostics. So both theologians, i.e. historians of early Christian thought, and students of ancient philosophy have a reason to think of this as a particularly significant treatise. It has been edited and commented on many times. I've mentioned on the handout the Paideia Antignostica of Cilento, as well as Harder's argument for the existence of the Großschrift. In recent years, whole monographs have been dedicated to Enneads II.9, for example, by Nicolas Spanu, and also by Jean-Marc Narbonne, among others. Some of these studies have been primarily interested in the content of the treatise or its place in the development of Plotinus's thought. Others have been concerned with the identification of the people against whom Plotinus is writing. And I want to start off by talking about this second question. If this treatise is written against the Gnostics, as Porphyry says, what exactly, or who exactly, are we to understand by the term Gnostic? Plotinus, you will remember, is not, by ancient standards, a particularly polemical author. And there are not many of his treatises which can be said to be against a particular school or a particular person. But this is one of those treatises which are, and it's written indeed in a much more impassioned and belligerent tone than we often find in Plotinus. He obviously feels that the people against whom he's writing have profoundly misconceived the meaning of Plato. They think themselves in some way superior to Plato, even though they also perhaps imagine themselves to be in some ways his interpreters. And having misconceived Plato, they have, of course, therefore also misconceived the nature of reality. And he seems to feel that they're a very present threat to his pupils. They're not just people a long way away whom we can smile at. They're not some totally discredited philosophy. They're people against to whom his own pupils might be in some way sympathetic, or that's what he seems to fear. In that sense, his polemic very much resembles the writings of early Christian authors like Irenaeus against the people that they call heretics, that they're also attacking people who are not merely stock figures or sort of recognized paradigms of error, but they're actually attacking people who are their rivals for the loyalty and allegiance of their pupils. Now, I've said more than once that Against the Gnostics is, as it were, a questionable title, because, of course, all the titles of the treatises that compose the Enneads, like the division of the treatises, are due to Porphyry as the editor, not to Plotinus as the author. And as with many other treatises, Porphyry has given two titles to this one. One is Against the Gnostics, and the other is Against those who say that the demiurge is evil, is kakos, or you might not want to translate kakos as evil, but in some ways as weak or malign, or anyway, certainly a good deal less than a divine being ought to be. And Porphyry, along with Iamblichus, is, so far as I know, the only pagan author who uses the term gnostikos as the name of a philosophical sect. And Iamblichus says nothing else about them, whereas Porphyry says that they were Christians, but heretics. Now, the name gnostikoi is used in early Christian heresiology, generally in a rather sparing way, possibly not in a totally consistent way. It's normal to use the term of heretics who do not have a named leader or heresiarch. So when Irenaeus writes against Valentinus or against Marcion, the two most dangerous heretics of his time in the 2nd century, in his view, he doesn't, certainly never uses the word Gnostic of the Marcionites, and as far as I can see, never strictly uses the word Gnostic of the Valentinians, although he does say that they derived their teaching from the Gnostics. The people whom he himself calls Gnostics are mentioned only at the end of his first book, Against the Heretics, and they have no named heresiarch or founder. It is also not clear that these people actually claim to be Christians. Undoubtedly, Valentinus and Marcion did claim to be Christians, and insofar as we can claim to have any writings of their followers, these writings also are evidently Christian in the sense that they do regard Jesus Christ as a central figure, as a redemptive figure, and as a revealer of truth. They also make use of ideas of St. Paul, and as well as many Old Testament texts. So there is no difficulty in identifying Valentinus and Marcion as Christians. On the other hand, the people that Irenaeus calls Gnostiki or Gnostiki Barbalo seem to hold opinions which are rather less similar to Orthodox Christianity than either Valentinus or Marcion, and although they may have some acquaintance with the Old Testament, they don't show such knowledge of the New Testament. Now, Irenaeus's usage has not been normative for many modern scholars. Modern scholars use the word Gnostic in a variety of ways. In some books, such as Berger Pearson's book on ancient Gnosticism, you'll find that it includes, for example, the Hermetic Corpus, the Chaldean Oracles, and Numenius of Apamea, none of whom would normally be regarded as Christians, even in a marginal or aberrant sense. And some scholars, Hans Jonas perhaps being the most famous, have thought of Gnosis, if not Gnosticism, as a universal movement in late antiquity, expressing a widespread sense of alienation, perhaps precipitated by the collapse of local cultures and the decline of the city-state in the face of Roman power. So there is a modern usage of the word Gnostic, which can cover a very wide variety of groups in the ancient world, although it doesn't normally apply to the Neoplatonists or to mainstream Christians like Irenaeus or Justin Martyr. But as I say, the usage of Irenaeus himself in the 2nd century seems to be more restrictive, and it's also, in my view, true of Hippolytus, the 3rd century heresiologist, and of Clement of Alexandria and of Origen, that they all use the term Gnostic in a much more restricted sense than modern scholars, even if they regard other heresies as in some respects Gnosticizing or indebted to the Gnostics. Now, what Porphyry says of the people that Plotinus is attacking is that they were Christians but heretics, Christianoi heretikoide, and they departed from the ancient philosophy or took the ancient philosophy as their starting point. It can be translated both ways. They alleged that Plato had not penetrated to the bathos or depth of the intellectual world. So these were people who defined themselves against Plato, which itself is interesting because we would not guess from Irenaeus that the people he's attacking had much interest in Plato at all, either negative or positive. But the way that these people present themselves to Porphyry and Plotinus is as critics, though perhaps also to some degree followers of Plato. Porphyry then gives us the valuable information that they had a number of authoritative texts: the Zostrianus, the Allogenes, the Nicotheus, the Marsanes, and the Zoroaster. The name Zoroaster, of course, is familiar. The others would have been very strange to Porphyry, as they seem quite strange to us. Now, according to Porphyry's Life of Plotinus, chapter 16, Aemilius, who is in many ways the most prominent student of Plotinus in the life and clearly Porphyry's own rival, wrote at great length against the work called Zostrianus. Porphyry himself demonstrated that the Zoroaster was not the real work of the Iranian prophet Zoroaster or Zarathustra. Porphyry doesn't tell us here or elsewhere by what criteria he was able to distinguish authentic or inauthentic writings attributed to Zoroaster. As anyone who knows the literature on modern literature on Zoroastrianism, even now there is very little agreement between scholars as to what works, if any, in the Zoroastrian corpus actually belong to the original Zarathustra. But anyway, Porphyry was quite sure that the claim to be by Zoroaster was mendacious. Now, until 1945, these names, Zostrianus, Allogenes, Marsanes at least, were really just names to scholars. We knew nothing else except that these texts had once existed and were used by people whom Porphyry describes as Gnostics. However, in 1945, there was the great discovery at Nag Hammadi of 11 codices, some of which, at least, may have come originally from the monastery of Kennaboskion, and which contained a great miscellany of texts, some of which evidently proceeded from the circles which Irenaeus would have described as heretical or even as Gnostic. These texts took some time to edit and have a rather murky transmission history, but they have now all been edited, translated, and discussed at great length by competent scholars in the field of Coptic studies. All of them in their present form are written in Coptic. It's assumed by most scholars that the majority of them, if not all of them, were not written in Coptic originally, but are translations, in some cases at least from Greek, although it's been argued that one or two of them might actually be translations from Syriac or Aramaic, particularly the so-called Gospel of Thomas. But the text that we are talking about today would almost certainly have existed originally in Greek, and obviously it was only in Greek that Porphyry and Plotinus would have known them. Now, to the great delight of scholars, these texts from Nag Hammadi include a text which is called Zostrianus, and which actually is also called on its seal the Book of Zoroaster and Zostrianus, another text which is called the Allogenes, and another text which is called the Marsanes. So nearly all the names which Porphyry gives us are actually attested also in the Nag Hammadi codices. And although there is no text attributed to Nicotheus, we did already know something about Nicotheus from the writings of Zosimus the alchemist, who probably lived around 300 AD, and may himself have been a kind of Christian, or even, as W.B. Scott said, a Christian Gnostic. So the Nag Hammadi codices have put into our hands a lot of evidence concerning the actual teachings of the people whom we knew previously only from the writings of Porphyry and Plotinus. Now, what we can say about all these codices is that these treatises is that, unlike some of the other treatises from Nag Hammadi, none of them is manifestly Christian. They occur in the vicinity of texts which are manifestly Christian, but many of them could be read as being pagan, although they clearly show an acquaintance with the Old Testament, as Christians call it, if not with the New. From the point of view of the history of Platonism, one of the most interesting characteristics is the presence in the Zostrianus and Allogenes of a triad of being, life, and mind. This figures also in Iamblichus, for certain, and in Proclus. In the Chaldean oracles, we find a similar triad, possibly the same triad, being dunamis and mind. And Porphyry seems to have been acquainted with this triad. We can argue that Plotinus himself is subtly, subliminally, as it were, using this triad in some of his writings, although he never actually gives it us in a clear form. And it can be traced all the way back to Plato's Sophist, to page 250 and following of the Sophist of Plato. So it's a genuine Platonic motif, which emerged in the analysis of the Noetic realm. So one of the questions to be asked is, did the authors of these treatises, the so-called Gnostics, invent the triad of being, life, and mind, or was it already present in the Platonic tradition before these Gnostics got hold of it? That's assuming, of course, that we can actually draw a distinction between the Platonic and the Gnostic tradition in the 2nd century. Now, a lot of interesting work pioneered by John Turner, carried on by Tuomas Rasimus, to some degree Gerard Bechtle, has been done in the last 20 years. Some of it linked to the anonymous commentary on the Parmenides, which Ado attributed to Porphyry. Those who think that the anonymous commentary is earlier and belongs to the 2nd century have argued that when we put together the Zostrianus and the Allogenes and the anonymous commentary, what we really see in the 2nd century is a kind of melting pot in which what we call Platonism and what we call Gnosticism have not yet really been distinguished. And we can talk just as justifiably of Gnostic influence on Platonism, or Platonic influence as of Platonic influence on Gnosticism. If you follow a more traditional approach and assume that Gnosticism and Platonism are mutually exclusive categories, and if you think that Platonism is bound to be the more authentic philosophy of the two, then you will say that these Nag Hammadi codices must actually be quite late. The manuscripts date from the 4th century. So if they really are, if they're influenced by Porphyry and Iamblichus, then we're not dealing with pre-Platinian versions, but with post-Platinian versions of these Gnostic texts. But I think the majority of scholars now would doubt this. I think they would argue that what we have under the name of Zostrianus and Allogenes is substantially what Porphyry himself read, and therefore that these texts were not written under the influence of Porphyry, but on the contrary, existed before him, whether or not we think that he was directly influenced by them. So anyway, there's an interesting question there as to what the relation of these texts is to the development of Platonism. Now, these texts are also clearly linked to a work which Porphyry does not mention, but which also appears in the Nag Hammadi codices under the title of the Apocryphon of John. This is one of the Gnostic texts which was already known before the Nag Hammadi codices were discovered, because it already exists in the Berlin Codex, which has been known since 1896. There are two versions of it at Nag Hammadi, And since we have these versions, we also know that the myth which Irenaeus attributes to the Gnostici Barbelo in Against Heresies 130, that this also is a paraphrase of the Apocryphon of John. So we have evidence that the Apocryphon of John is probably the most widely read and the most seminal of all the texts which we can associate with the Zostrianus and Diogenes. We associate them because of affinity of content. So as I say, even though Porphyry himself does not mention the Apocryphon of John by name, we can say that if the authors of the Zostrianus and Diogenes were Gnostics, then the authors of the Apocryphon of John were presumably Gnostics as well. So this means that we have quite a substantial body of literature which we can attribute to people who were known in the ancient world as Gnostikoi, whether Plotinus himself was familiar with that nomenclature or not. Now, like the other texts, the Apocryphon of John, for the most part, is not an explicitly Christian work, although it is a kind of subversive commentary on the opening chapters of Genesis. However, the only title which it ever bears, as far as we know, is the Apocryphon of John. And the version that occurs in Nag Hammadi Codices 2.1 begins with a disputation between John the Apostle and a Pharisee called Arimaeus, as a matter of fact, the name of the evil principle in Zoroastrianism. So this would suggest that it was a text written for a Christian audience, because obviously no one but Christians will be interested in the secret teaching of someone called John, if the John in question is John the Apostle. So despite the absence of explicitly Christian material, it doesn't seem unreasonable to think of the Apocryphon of John as a Christian work. Obviously, it would, at least by later standards, be a heretical and aberrant work. If it was written in the early part of the 2nd century AD, the absence of reference to the New Testament would hardly be surprising, since quite possibly many of the documents which now compose the New Testament hadn't even been written, and even those which had been written would not yet have acquired a scriptural status. So we can say with reasonable confidence that the Apocryphon of John and the other texts I've mentioned do represent the teaching of the group that Porphyry describes as Gnostic. Now, in modern historiography, we often find the word Sethian used to characterize these texts. The reason for that is that Theodoret gives the name Sethianoi or Scythianoi to the people whom Irenaeus calls Gnostici Barbelo. And we must remember the text of Irenaeus, which is in Latin, is quite probably corrupt here. But anyway, he doesn't give the name Scythians to them, but Theodoret does. In order to avoid fruitless disputes about the application of the term Gnostic, many modern scholars therefore prefer to use the term Sethian of this particular group. But whether that actually represents any ancient usage apart from that of Theodoret, I'm not sure. Clearly, the usage of Porphyry himself is to call them Gnostikoi. So almost certainly, we do have writings written by the Gnostics of Plotinus. And as I've said, we have reason to think that the authors and users of these texts would have regarded themselves in some sense as Christian, even if they didn't define the term Christian in the way that we might define it now. Now, that being said, there is nothing in Plotinus's own polemic against them which suggests that he is aware that they're Christians. Indeed, it's difficult to find any evidence that Plotinus was aware of Christianity at all. Now, this, of course, strongly differentiates him from his pupil Porphyry. Porphyry was notorious for his writings against Christianity. He was supposedly the author of 15 logoi, or discourses, against the Christians. And testimonies to these logoi are found in Eusebius and Augustine, explicitly and perhaps implicitly in the writings of other Christian apologists. His notoriety as a critic of Christianity was so great that his books were actually burnt according to an edict of the Emperor Constantine. So there's no doubt at all that Porphyry knew a great deal about Christianity. When he says that the opponents of Plotinus were Christian heretics called Gnostics, there's no reason to suppose that he was ill-informed. He may, of course, have been tendentious for some reason or other, but certainly he was not talking in ignorance. Plotinus, on the other hand, as I say, does not refer to them as Christians or indeed as Gnostics. He does say at one point that he's speaking with some eidos, with some diffidence or shame, because some of the people who hold the doctrine he's attacking are friends. Now, some surprising reveries have been inspired by this use of the word friend, and people have devised Gnostic philosophies of friendship on the basis of it. But quite clearly, Plotinus is invoking Plato's statement in Republic 595 that whatever eidos we have for Homer, we can't allow him into the ideal city. And then, of course, also the famous text in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, 1096a, truth has to be preferred even to our friends, even to our philoi, where Aristotle seems to be referring to Plato himself. And so, although Aristotle doesn't say it in those terms, Aristotle's aphorism is often now quoted in the form, I love Plato, but I love truth more. This is evidently the tradition on which Plotinus is drawing. So he's saying that these people whom he's attacking are people who were once part of his own circle, effectively, as Aristotle was once a pupil of Plato, and no doubt a friend in some sense, as Speusippus and Xenocrates. So Plotinus is speaking of the Gnostics as persons with whom he was once associated intellectually. This would suggest that they were people that he knew as fellow pupils when he was taught by Ammonius Saccas in Alexandria. There are certainly people, although Plotinus, of course, was speaking in Rome when he delivered his polemic against the Gnostics, we can see from the names of some of his companions that there were Egyptians, people from Alexandria, in his circle at Rome, and obviously Alexandria is where he himself studied for 11 years with Ammonius Saccas. In the view of some scholars, he would have encountered at least one notable Christian while he was in the school of Ammonius Saccas, that's to say Origen, although Origen, the Christian, is much older than Plotinus and 20 years older, so they can hardly have been friends in the ordinary sense. And there is much discussion as to whether the Origen whom Porphyry talks about in the Life of Plotinus actually is the Christian Origen or someone else. But there's no particular unlikelihood in Plotinus having known in Alexandria some people who thought of themselves as Platonists, as Christians. And obviously, if they were members of the school of Ammonius Saccas, then they would in some sense have been students of Plato as well. Now, although Plotinus doesn't mention Christianity, one could say that many of the attacks that Plotinus makes on the Gnostics in this treatise are the kind of attacks that could be made on Christians. So these are people, he says, in Enneads 2.9.9, who imagine themselves to be superior to the heavens, and they choose to be idiotai. They choose to opt out of the business of the world. As Christians, of course, were accused by Celsus, for example, of being bad citizens and having nothing to do with the defense of the Roman Commonwealth. Idiotai can also be used of people who are not well instructed in philosophy, and he may wish to imply that as well. The Gnostics deny the eternity of the cosmos, something which Plotinus, like most Platonists of his time, believed in very strongly. They think of diseases as evil spirits that can be expelled by incantations. Now, in the 2nd century, Tatian, at least, did believe that diseases are caused by demons, and so did Minucius Felix, who may well have been writing in the 2nd century or early in the 3rd on behalf of Christianity. These people imagine that Providence cares for them individually, whereas Plotinus thinks that you can't expect Providence to take account specifically of you and your concerns and answer your prayers rather than someone else's. Providence is rather the just and harmonious government of the world for everyone, and your business is to conform yourself to providence, not to expect providence to conform itself to you. But of course, Christians do expect that God will answer their prayers. There's a whole treatise by Origen on this. However paradoxical it may seem, Origen says, we do believe that God can answer individual prayers. Moreover, these people think that all they have to do to stand well with God is to look to God. That in other words, they don't have to cultivate virtue. This is what Christians have come to call the doctrine of justification by faith. Whether it exactly is what Paul teaches or not, it's certainly easy to read Paul as saying that all you have to do is believe that you're saved and you are saved. All you have to do is believe that you're a son of God and you are a son of God. Totally antipathetic to the teaching of Plotinus, for whom any kind of divinity was only the reward of austere discipline of mind and body. Plotinus says, if these people hate the world as much as they claim to, well, why don't they just leave it? Why don't they just commit suicide? Exactly the same point that Celsus, the Platonic rhetorician, had made against Christians in the 2nd century. And in fact, it's a jibe made by Epicurus against people who dislike the world as well, which is rather ironic because Plotinus also compares the Gnostics with Epicureans on the grounds that they don't believe the world to be good. I mean, it's rather odd, of course. I mean, in some sense, the Gnostics have a doctrine of providence, apparently. But on the other hand, the Gnostics also believe that the world was created by a kind of mistake, as I shall explain later. They certainly don't believe that the world is the product of benign deities or a benign deity who rules it for the best. So in that sense, they can be coupled with the Epicureans. However different they are in other respects, neither the Gnostics nor the Epicureans attribute the origin of the world to divine wisdom and benevolence. And although they may think that providence has a special design for them, they don't think that providence has any design for the world as a whole. They think of salvation as being taken out of the world rather than the world itself being an object of salvation. Now, Christians and Epicureans were in fact coupled in some ancient polemic. We find this, for example, in Lucian's Alexander or the False Prophet. Alexander of Eutychus, whom Lucian himself does not approve of, setting himself up as a god, denounces the Christians and Epicureans who don't believe in him. He denounces them both as atheists. And whether, although Alexander of Eutychus may not himself be a good witness, it certainly seems to be true that Epicureans were regarded as atheists because they didn't believe that the gods care for the world, and Christians were attacked as atheists because they didn't worship the same gods that other people worshipped. So they could certainly both be thought of as atheists and they could be in some way coupled despite the obvious differences between them. Now, of course, Christians themselves strongly differentiated themselves from Epicureans because Catholic or Orthodox Christianity, mainstream Christianity, thinks of God, the giver of the Jewish law and the father of Jesus Christ, as also the creator of the world. It's axiomatic for the thought of Irenaeus and Origen and Hippolytus, and later of Augustine and Gregory of Nyssa, that the world is good and that the evil in it is not the work of God himself, and that God himself will finally banish evil from the world and will save those who deserve to be saved. So mainstream Christianity is certainly not Epicurean. On the other hand, Gnostic Christianity doesn't have the same optimistic view of the world that Catholic Christianity does, although, as we shall see, it also doesn't believe the world to have come into existence by chance, as the Epicureans did. What they argue, according to Plotinus, is that the world actually arose as a result of a kind of tragic fall or sin or schism in the divine world itself. There was a multiplication of divine hypostases, and Sophia, or wisdom, one of these hypostases, made the mistake of looking down at matter. She saw her own reflection in the dark, subjacent universe of matter, and she fell in love with it, in some way mated with it, it seems, and produced a reflection of this reflection, eidolon eidolou, a phrase which occurs in several contexts in Plotinus, and this was the demiurge, the being who actually created the world. Now, this doesn't sound very like what you read in the New Testament, doesn't sound very like what you would read in anywhere in Plotinus. It's certainly not something that Plotinus has made up, because almost exactly the same myth occurs in the seminal text called the Apocryphon of John. Even the words reflection of a reflection occur in the Apocryphon. In the Zostrianus, which is much more corrupt than the Apocryphon of John, there seems to be a very similar account. So the Gnostics of Plotinus on these grounds can be identified with the Gnostici Barbelo or Sethians, as Gerhard Elsas argued. Henri Pouec argued rather for Valentinianism, but this was before the Nag Hammadi codices were really appreciated. And one of the differences between Valentinian and Sethian thought is that Valentinians appear to see matter as the result of the fall of Sophia or wisdom from the Godhead, whereas Sethians see matter as having been already there. Now, in the myth recorded by Plotinus, matter is already there. It's matter that causes the fall of Sophia. Whereas for the Valentinians, Sophia falls because she aspires to forbidden knowledge of the Father, or because she wants to assert her independence and act without her consort, Helema, or will. But matter is then the result of her tears of repentance. So it would certainly seem that the myth which Plotinus regards as central to Gnostic teaching is what we would now call a Sethian myth and not a Valentinian one. There is a narrative in the Hermetica, the first Hermeticon, the Poimandres, of the heavenly Anthropos being seduced by his own reflection in underlying matter, although the Poimandres is a somewhat more optimistic text than the Apocryphon of John, and it's not quite as tragic an event as it's represented to be in texts that are strictly Gnostic. We also have, interestingly, a passage in Numenius, fragment 16, De Place, from Eusebius, as always. The second god, the god who presumably represent, in Numenius, roughly speaking, I would say that the first god represents Plato's form of the good in the Republic, and the second god represents the demiurge of the Timaeus. So the second god, which is the demiurge of Plato, looks away from the first mind, looks away from the good, and looks towards matter. And as a result, he undergoes a schism, and a third god emerges who may or may not be identified with the world, but certainly is inferior to the second god. And Numenius may well have been familiar with groups that we call Gnostic. It also seems from Porphyry's testimony in the Cave of the Nymphs that he was acquainted with Genesis 1:3, where the Spirit of God moves on the face of the waters, a text which is also quoted verbatim in the Apocryphon of John. Numenius also speaks of special providence. He speaks of providence as touching each person as well as the entire world. And he even seems to believe in some kind of bodily resurrection. There are a number of peculiar tenets of Numenius, in other words, which remind us of Christianity and also of the Gnostic form of Christianity. It's been suggested by John Whitaker that he had read Philo, and someone who imitates Philo is certainly going to display traits which are similar to those of Christianity. I don't think we want to go so far as to say that Numenius was a Christian or was a Gnostic, let alone that he was a Jew. It's probably better to think of being part of an intellectual ferment in the 2nd century where these labels could not be so definitively applied as they were by the 3rd century. But certainly he seems to move in a world in which Gnostic, Christian, and Jewish literature is familiar and available for use, a world rather different from that of the later Neoplatonists or of 3rd and 4th century Christianity. And E.R. Dodds, noting that in many ways Numenius has Gnostic traits, argues that this was the point at which Plotinus wanted to make it clear that he no longer subscribed to the teaching of Numenius. Those of you who have read the Life of Plotinus will know that his pupil Emilius was supposed to be so devoted to Numenius that he had the works of Numenius by heart. Proclus says of Porphyry that it would be very surprising if Porphyry were to disagree with Numenius. And Porphyry records that Plotinus himself was alleged by some of his detractors to have stolen the whole of his philosophy from Numenius. And Porphyry then quotes a letter by his former tutor Longinus, whom Irenaeus has mentioned, in which Longinus, according to Porphyry, affirms the originality of Plotinus and dissociates himself from those who want to reduce the teaching of Plotinus to that of Numenius. It's not clear that Longinus says everything that Porphyry wants him to say, but anyway, certainly Porphyry thinks that this allegation of dependence on Numenius is to be defended. Among other things, Dodds argues that a more positive view of matter arises as a result of this valediction to Numenius. So in Enneads 2.4, matter is a prime evil. This is a 12th treatise and therefore written before against the Gnostics, which is the 33rd. On the other hand, in Enneads 1.8, number 51, a very late treatise, matter is seen somewhat more favorably. Since Dodds, many readers have doubted this. They've argued that that you can't really polarize the teaching of Enneads 2.4 and Enneads 1.8 as much as Dodds did, and that perhaps it's rather difficult to see evidence of profound alteration in Plotinus's philosophy, which is a pity, of course, because Plotinus is one of the very few philosophers of antiquity whose works have come to us, whose works have a known chronological order. So if we could plot development of thought in anybody, it would be in Plotinus. But then we must remember that none of Plotinus's treatises was actually produced until he was over 40 years old, and therefore it's reasonable to assume that his thought had already attained a certain maturity and probably wasn't going to undergo radical transformations since then. Now, as I said, Enneads 2.9 has been seen as the fourth treatise in a single treatise called the Großschrift, which Porphyry then allegedly carved up into 4 treatises. We know that Porphyry does this with some other treatises, carves them. Usually he puts the different parts of the treatise consecutively, but in this case, if he has done what Harder claims, then he's actually scattered the 4 limbs of the Großschrift over the Enneads. Why would he do this? Well, first of all, he wants 54 Enneads because the number 9 times 6 is significant to him. Secondly, he wants to arrange the treatises in such a way that the soul is treated before the intellect and the intellect is treated before the one. So if he felt that the Großschrift crossed those boundaries and contained material belonging to more than one Ennead, then it was perhaps natural that he would distribute them, parts of it, over the corpus, as he has allegedly done. But that being said, there are notable scholars, including, I think, John Rist, who have never accepted that the Großschrift ever was a single text. We could, of course, argue that since certainly these 4 treatises were written consecutively, whether they were written as part of one treatise or not, that there will be a continuity of thought and argument in them, whether Plotinus intended them to be read together or not. And of course, we don't really know a great deal about what Plotinus's own intentions were regarding the publication of his thoughts, over which, as Porphyry says, he seems to have exercised very little influence. Anyway, as a Großschrift stands, Enneads 3.8 would be part 1. So that's treatise 30 on nature, contemplation, and the one. So Plotinus begins this treatise with taking the eternity of the world more or less for granted. This, of course, was arguable. Many people, including most Christians, believe that Plato's Timaeus actually described the creation of the world. Plato, after all, said that the world was genetos, and therefore it was argued it must have a beginning in time. Aristotle had argued that an eternal demiurge who was good would have no reason to create at one time rather than another. And this position was accepted by Platonists, so of course they couldn't accept that Plato was wrong. So they argued that, in fact, the description of the creation of the world by the demiurge was mythical, that the word genetos meant dependent on the noetic realm, but did not mean created in time, and that's the position that Plotinus holds. So what has actually happened in the process of creation is that a logos has contemplated the idea in the noetic realm and has brought that idea into existence in what we might call a lower realm of being, the realm, the physical realm, as we would call it. Now, nature itself is here treated almost as a personal being, as a kind of soul which by contemplation brings forth the physical universe. But the contemplation of nature is not so perfect as the contemplation by a human soul. And of course, contemplation by a human soul is not so perfect as contemplation by the intellect. So we have a kind of hierarchy of contemplators, of which nature is the lowest. But nonetheless, nature brings forth a physical order by contemplating the noetic realm, which is basically good. Nature does this in silence, which is interesting. It's interesting that this text should specify silence, because that's also a fundamental term in Sethian texts. In the Marsanes, the unknown silent one is superior to the Ian Barbalo, which appears, some scholars anyway think, is taken from the opening verse of Genesis, meaning that God founded, created the world. But superior to the creator of the world, if you like, is this unknown silent one in Marsanes. In the three steles of Seth, silence is the climax of contemplation, although it's not entirely clear that the three steles of Seth is what we would call the Sethian work. Just because a text contains the name of Seth, the third son of Adam, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's what we would call Sethian. In the Zostrianus, the triad, existence, vitality, mentality, in other words, being, life, and mind, is also the basis of an assent. So Plotinus may be using in his philosophy terms which were also fundamental to his opponent's system. And if he really was thinking of Enneads 2.9 when he wrote Enneads 3.8, then he may be already appropriating these terms and giving them what he considers to be their proper meaning, rather than the illicit meaning which has been given to them by his Gnostic opponents. The second part of the Großschrift, or certainly the next treatise in chronological order, is the famous treatise that the intelligibles are not outside the intellect. It was this idea which, according to Longinus, distinguished Longinus' own position from that of Plotinus. So you will remember that in the Timaeus, the demiurge, which Plotinus identifies with nous, the second hypostasis, creates a world in imitation of a paradigm. So a question that exercised Plato's followers is, what exactly is the relation between the contemplating demiurge and the contemplated paradigm? Is the demiurge in some respect, some way inferior to the paradigm? Does the paradigm dictate to him what kind of world he must create? Or is the demiurge actually the creator of the paradigm? Is the paradigm, as it were, his thought, in the way that Philo would certainly have thought that the paradigm of the cosmos was the thought of God? Longinus believed that the paradigm is outside the demiurge, whereas Plotinus argues that the intelligible realm, i.e. the paradigm, is within and indeed coterminous with the contemplating intellect, which Plato calls the demiurge. So Plotinus argues that when you perceive any object, the intellect unites with the form of that object. That's a good Aristotelian principle. The demiurgic intellect, which is nous, must therefore be coextensive with the ideas that nous contemplates. They must be exactly coterminous. Neither can be outside the other. There can be no remainder in either. Nous contains the noeta, but equally the noeta are coterminous with nous, so there's nothing left over in the noetic realm which is not contemplated by nous. There's nothing left over in nous which is not contemplating the noetic realm. So the literal interpretation of the Timaeus is to be rejected. This means, in a sense, that nous and the ideas, the contemplating subject and the contemplated object, are identical. But the ideas, of course, are many. You will remember that Aristotle thinks of God as a self-contemplating mind or self-contemplating thought. And since Aristotle does not explicitly hold a theory of ideas, it can be argued that effectively his idea of God is a kind of infinite regress of thought contemplating thought. Some scholars have argued that even in Aristotle, Charles Kahn, for example, there is some notion of the ideas giving content to the divine mind. Whether that's true or not of Aristotle, it's clearly true for Plotinus. So in one sense, nous is one. In another sense, nous is many, because nous is coterminous with, and therefore in a way identical with, the realm of ideas. So nous is not truly one, it's one many. And that's why nous can't be the source of its own unity. That's why something higher than nous has to be contemplated, has to be posited, which is the source of the unity of nous itself. That is why Plotinus has to give us the doctrine of the one, the ineffable one, the one without predicates, the one which in a certain sense doesn't even exist or transcends existence. This must be posited in order to explain the unity of the noetic realm. Now, what is the relation of the one to the good of Plato? In this treatise, at least, it could be regarded as either the good or superior to the good, but it must certainly be everywhere. It must certainly be the good must be the final cause of everything. And the one also must be everywhere, because nothing can exist unless it has unity. The one is not only the source of the unity of the world, it's also the source of the unity of everything in the world. So it's in a certain sense, a source of multiplicity as well as a source of unity. But nothing actually participates directly in it, which is why it can never be described as many. So Plotinus is here explaining to us why the one needs to be posited, although his most extensive discussions of what it means for the one to be one are to be found in the 6th Ennead rather than in Enneads 5.5. So if this treatise is written with the Gnostics in mind, then it's clear at least that that nothing can be distinct from the good. Everything is in some way the product of nous. Everything has a purpose, because nous always has a purpose. That purpose must be the good. It's impossible that there's anything in the cosmos which is radically evil in the sense that it's evil in the very origin of its existence. If there is evil, it must in some way be supervenient. Then in Enneads 5.8 on intellectual beauty, which is the next treatise, the beautiful has already entered Plotinus thinking at Enneads 5.12. And at this point, we are warned that the beautiful is the beautiful can seduce us from the good. The relation between the good and the beautiful is one of many enigmas in the works of Plato. We meet the good, of course, in the Republic as the object of philosophical aspiration. On the other hand, in the Phaedrus and in the Symposium, beauty seems to be predominant, and it's not entirely clear what the relation of the good to the beautiful is, or even whether the good is an object of aspiration. Obviously, Neoplatonists could not accept that there was any inconsistency or any kind of lacuna between one Platonic dialogue and another, so the good and the beautiful have to be related somehow. For Plotinus, the beautiful is effectively the manifestation of the good, the objectification of the agathos. Therefore, you don't find the beautiful without the good, or the good without the beautiful. But nonetheless, there is still this hierarchy. The good is still higher than the beautiful. It is the proper object of philosophical aspiration. As Plato's comments on the demiurge, creating because he was good, had indicated, that which is higher always overflows or superabounds to the lower level. It's precisely because the good is good that it wants to communicate itself to every possible level of existence, even to the physical level of existence, which in some ways is bound to be inferior to the noetic level of existence, just as the noetic level of existence itself is inferior to the good, properly so called. And yet the good superabounds into these lower levels. And there's no possibility for Plotinus of wisdom being anything other than nous. There could not be some kind of divine wisdom which somehow fell away from nous or thought itself cleverer than intellect. Obviously, it wouldn't be wisdom at all. There can be, if the world originates from the overflowing of the good, then there's no possibility of a transgression or folly or rupture in the divine being the cause of the world. So although Plotinus doesn't say this explicitly, because he's not writing explicitly against the Gnostics, we could argue that the point of Enneads 5.8 is to prepare us for the attack on the Gnostics in Enneads 2.9, which is in fact the next treatise. So let's come finally then to the actual content of Enneads 2.9. Plotinus begins by saying that there can only be three transcendent principles. The Gnostics seem to think there are many more and give them all kinds of fanciful names. But the first principle, the one or the good, which certainly seem to be identical here, isn't actually part of a series because you can't coordinate it with anything else. But we have to give some kind of name to the first principle. And since it is the source of unity, and since it is the source of goodness, we call it the one or the good. We express its absolute simplicity through these terms. And we might say, does absolute simplicity effectively amount to nothingness? It's rather like saying that a point is position without dimension. Does that mean that it doesn't really exist? In the same way, when simplicity reaches its absolute extreme, how do you distinguish simplicity from nothing at all? Well, that's a question which many people have put to Plotinus, but anyway, all that Plotinus has to say here is that, strictly speaking, the one or the good is outside every series, but we have to give it this name because it's a source of those things which we call unity and goodness. Nous, therefore, because it's one many and not absolutely simple, can't be identical with the one. So we do need to posit a second principle. And soul is a principle of motion. Now, nous is always at rest. Nous is the realm of those things which are self-identical, those things which are essentially what they are. And therefore, the mobile realm of soul must be distinguished from the realm of nous. So we do have to posit three first principles. Do we need four first principles? For example, logos? No, he says. Soul has a capacity for intellection. Soul has a capacity for noetic activity. Soul is, as it were, the mobile aspect of nous. Nous is, as it were, the static aspect of soul. We don't need to put something like logos in between nous and soul. Now, of course, we're familiar with the word logos from the prologue of John. It's a fundamental term in Christian thought, Orthodox Christian thought, identified with the second person of the Trinity. We also find it in some texts from Nag Hammadi, though it's not a prominent term in the text that we call Sethian. But anyway, whether he knows it or not, Plotinus does seem here to be making a judgment on a fundamental Christian doctrine. In chapters 2 to 4, soul is capable of falling. He doesn't, not wisdom, of course, but if soul ceases to gaze on beauty, which is its road to the good, then it will indeed descend. As Plotinus says in many places, soul has the possibility of looking up, looking down, or looking towards itself. Now, soul is certainly in some sense meant to look down because soul is meant to illuminate the lower realm. It's meant to transmit the illumination of the higher realm to the lower realm. But it's meant to do that without actually falling into the lower realm or becoming enamored of it. The world soul, for example, contrives to manage the world and maintain its eternal harmony without actually ever falling into the world and becoming subject to it. Now, just as soul must always be illuminating the lower realm, matter must always exist, because if there's any such thing as matter at all, then if it ceased to exist, there's no reason why it would come back into existence. Notoriously, Plotinus is somewhat equivocal as to whether matter is the product of soul, as for example, Dennis O'Brien has argued, or whether matter is given to the soul. But certainly what the soul does in Plotinus is, as he says, to cover matter. Body arises as a result of matter being in some way embraced by soul. And in fact, body is in soul rather than soul being in body. But the fact that the world soul does not fall means that the illumination of the lower realm by soul is not the same thing as the loss of the soul's wings in the Phaedrus. So the condescension of soul, if you like, does not necessarily entail a fall, whereas the Gnostics seem to be arguing effectively that the world soul is fallen. The only way in Platonic terms you could express what the Gnostics are saying when they say that Sophia fell away from the Godhead is to say that the world soul has become enamored of the world and has become a prisoner of the world which it ought to control. Now, what's wrong with the Gnostics? Why have they come to this silly position? Well, in Enneads 2.9.5 and following, they don't recognize the beauty of the present world. They've got strange talk of pyrokesis and metanoia, words which designate pilgrimage and repentance, and which certainly have their home in Christianity. That's because they've got hold of Plato's myths of the afterlife, and they've gathered from these myths that body's a kind of tomb of the soul, and that perhaps the soul would be better off if it weren't in the world. And therefore, because individual souls keep falling and keep returning reluctantly to the world to expiate the sins of the previous life, they somehow assume that the soul of the universe is going to say the same thing. They assume that the soul of the universe has the same kind of power to do good or evil that an ordinary soul does. But in fact, of course, because the world soul is good, just like Nous, just like the One, it can't do other than it actually does. And even the individual soul, according to Plotinus, doesn't descend simply as a result of a fall. It's the universal economy, it's what it means to be a soul that you animate a body. Every soul exists for the good of the body that it animates. Every soul exists for the good of the cosmos. There's nothing wrong with soul animating body. It only becomes wrong when the proper hierarchy of body and soul ceases to be maintained. Now, instead of recognizing this, the Gnostics seem to think of themselves as fallen spirits within an essentially evil world. And they think that the being whom they call God exists to rescue them from that world. So the being that they call God is not the creator, but the redeemer, which is the standard position of all systems that we call Gnostic. But why on earth would this God be so careful of them and not of anyone else? What have they done to earn the favor of this God, Cineas Plotinus? After all, they're clearly not very good philosophers, because he goes on in 2.9.10 to say that they can't really give any good reason for the fall of wisdom. Obviously, why would wisdom be called wisdom if it couldn't maintain its place in the divine realm? They can't explain where this darkness comes from that wisdom falls into. Do they think that wisdom or soul created the darkness itself? And thus he throws back at them the question which many modern scholars throw at him as to, is soul responsible for the origin of matter? And then in Enneads 2.9.13 to 18, he argues that it's arrogant to denounce the cosmos. We should accept it's just obvious that those beings who administer the whole of the cosmos must be superior to us. I mean, we're not capable of doing this for ourselves. And once we recognize that these beings are superior and that they presumably therefore have other aims and other principles than ours, we can't expect them to administer the whole world for our sake. It's just a complete inversion of the proper economy to think that the world exists for us rather than that we exist for the world. Personifying diseases as evil spirits is to imply effectively that death itself has no place in the ideal realm. And of course, this is what Christians believe. Christians believe that death is a result of a fall, which ought not to have occurred. But as far as Plotinus is concerned, so long as you live in the realm of generation, you must expect to die. It's only in the noetic realm that you can expect immortality. So why personify diseases as evil spirits when they're simply ministers of nature? To think that you can be saved without virtue is even worse than denying providence. And of course, the two go together, since providence ordains that virtue will be rewarded. For that matter, thinking that providence cares only for human beings and not for everything else is also impious. This is a question which is also raised by Celsus, and Origen responds to it in Book 4 of Contra Celsum, arguing with the Stoics that human beings do have a special place in the divine economy, and not with the Platonists, that the divine economy cares for all sentient beings. Plotinus says all you have to do is contemplate the heavens and you'll see that the world as a whole is akin to the intellectual gods. And so to think that only this little bit of the world which is human is the concern of the gods is once again overweening. Now, of course, it's possible that the Gnostics just don't feel any awe when they contemplate the heavens, but then that's surely something they should recognize as a fault in them. If their soul were truly akin to the world soul, to the unfallen soul of the world, then they would recognize the world for the beautiful domain that it is. And so that is the end of Enneads 2.9, and according to Harder, the end of the entire Großschrift. Now, as I said, Porphyry is the editor of this treatise, the one who gave it the title Against the Gnostics. And there is a tradition in Socrates Scholasticus that Porphyry had been born as a Christian and had apostatized. Nothing in Porphyry's own works suggests this, although he had met the Christian Origen. But of course, he wouldn't necessarily say so. It certainly seems to be true that Porphyry has a tendency to use terminology which is not Platinian and is rather more reminiscent of Christianity. For example, he's also the person who gives the phrase uses the phrase three hypostases as the title of Enneads 5.1. You do find the word hypostasis quite a lot in Plotinus, but not the expression three hypostases. Likewise, he speaks of the one as the God above all. Plotinus is quite hesitant as to whether you should apply the term theos to the one or not. Porphyry is much less hesitant, and this actual phrase, God above all, can be paralleled about 80 times in the works of Origen. He's alleged by some, of course, to be the author of the anonymous commentary on the Parmenides, although this has been disputed, and he may have introduced the term being, life, and mind into Platonic parlance, although that again is not certain. One point which I will end with, because I don't think it's been made by other scholars, is that he does appear that there is a coincidence between one tenet of his and an aphorism that we find in the Valentinian text called the Gospel of Philip. Porphyry says in his letter to Marcella that there are four virtues: faith, hope, love, and truth. Faith, of course, pistis, hope, elpis, but where St. Paul would say agape, Porphyry says eros, and then Porphyry adds this fourth virtue to the Christian triad, aletheia, or truth. And we find this also in the Gospel of Philip, which is not a Sethian text, but a Valentinian text from Nag Hammadi. This might well suggest that Porphyry did have some acquaintance with Gnostic literature, quite independently of the controversy with the Gnostics of Plotinus, that he might have been acquainted with Valentinian literature as well as with Sethian literature. None of this proves that he was born as a Christian, but I think we can certainly say that Porphyry had an interest in a variety of Christian phenomena, both orthodox and unorthodox, as we would call them. And I think that he does see Neoplatonism as a superior philosophy to Christianity, but sometimes he uses terminology which he thinks will commend it to Christians or illustrate the fact that Neoplatonism is doing better what Christianity is doing in a very haphazard and dilettantish way. And if that is how he thought about the relation of Platonism to Christianity, then of course it's the exact reverse of what Origen the Christian would have said, which is that Plato was trying to do what the Bible does, but in a rather amateurish and haphazard way. And as far as I can see, that is basically the point at issue in the 3rd century between Platonists and Christians. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for this great and very rich talk. We now have some time for discussion. Please use the chat box to say that you have a question. It is easier for me so that we can keep the order. So a queue would be enough. Otherwise, I can try to see hands as well, but I'm not sure I will keep the order. So Professor Altman, please.
Thank you so much, Professor Edwards, for that wonderful talk. I have so many questions for you. I just want to give you a choice between two. One relates to a passage in Zeke Mazur's commentary on 2.9 that I just came across and found very interesting, that makes some connections to your talk. The other is more general, arising from the very pleasant hours I spent in company of your translation of Porphyry's Life of Plotinus, and the very nice notes to that translation. Which would you prefer, a more Edwards question or a question that impinges on Mazur as well?
Well, I'm sure I'm more competent to answer the question about the Life of Plotinus. But,
all right. So the question I have about Porphyry is, you referred at one point to the subject of my question, which is when Porphyry quotes Longinus. And you made a comment, I don't remember your exact words, but it was something along the lines of, I'm not sure that the passage from Longinus says exactly what Porphyry wants it to say. I would like to query that a little bit and bring it into context with that very interesting point you made at the end about the fourth virtue, aletheia, entering the Porphyrian catalog of virtues. It seems to me, and this is what I want to ask you about, I mean, in a very general sense, why do you think Porphyry supplies so much information that could actually be used to call into question a hagiographic portrait of the master Plotinus? And more specifically, why does he include so much data from Longinus, who clearly had very, very little use for Plotinus, and makes some very excellent points against him? I've read a number of people that kind of think that Porphyry is just a straight hagiographer, but it strikes me that he's quite brutally honest about Plotinus, and I want to ask you about that. Why do you think Porphyry preserves so much data that can so easily be used? And of course, just a sideshow into Mazur, I mean, there are just a few details in Porphyry's Life of Plotinus that Mazur uses to construct quite a damning portrait of Plotinus. Why do you think Porphyry does that? Do you think he's just unconscious that they can be used that way? Or might you agree with me that he's a more subtle writer than we think, and that aletheia was a virtue that he applied in his Life of Plotinus?
That's very interesting. Thank you. I mean, I assume that the rhetorical point of the letters from Longinus is to say, well, here's a man that we know was highly critical of Plotinus, but even he bears witness to the intellectual stature and originality of him. So, we allow the detraction to be seen so that, the force of the commendation can be obvious as well. And I think one could say that Eusebius, actually, particularly in the Praeparatio Evangelica, often does the same thing, that he will often quote texts in order to make a particular point, which in other respects, might be quite inimical to Eusebius's project. The Numenius, for example, is clearly, from Eusebius's point of view, a Gnostic, but actually, Eusebius doesn't dwell on that fact. He simply dwells on Numenius as a witness to some kind of Trinitarian thinking. So it may be characteristic of this period that people are expected, to show all their working, as it were, and not be tampering with the texts that they use. It is, I think, widely accepted now that the real hero of the Life of Plotinus is Porphyry, and that he's certainly aggrandizing himself at the expense of Aemilius. I don't know whether there's any possibility that he's even aggrandizing himself a little at the expense of Plotinus. I mean, certainly, of course, he makes the point that Plotinus's Greek wasn't really good enough, and that Porphyry has improved it. And no doubt he thinks that he's given a more systematic form to Plotinus's thought than Porphyry himself was able to do. And incidentally, he belittles the scholia of Aemilius while saying this. So, I mean, it may be that perhaps some of the detraction from Plotinus is not unconscious. I don't know. I hadn't really thought about it, but it could well be that Porphyry's self-aggrandizement extends even to a certain diminution of his master.
Thank you.
Professor Onassis, please.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, Professor Edwards, I found your note on Porphyry quite intriguing, not only because Porphyry really has something to do with the Christians, but I would like to ask you, if possible, to comment a little bit more about on what do you mean by the Numenian circles. I mean, just when we meet things like hoi peri Numenius, hoi peri Atticus, and so on, so quite frequently it includes just Atticus and Numenius. So who could be, how you could say, imagine Porphyry dealing with Numenian circles in his time? I mean, and what he could take from all this, and so it's really an interesting proposition. Maybe you can comment a little bit more on this.
I don't know whether we can talk about a circle of Numenius. His treatise on the good is a dialogue in form. That doesn't, of course, prove that it's written. I mean, it could therefore be, as with Augustine, that the interlocutor is a pupil, but it doesn't. I don't think it's possible to say on the evidence we have. I mean, the trouble with Numenius is that we actually have several different pictures of Numenius in different authors. So the metaphysical Numenius, as it were, is known to us primarily from Eusebius. He's the one who gives us most of the quotations. From Origen, we only know of Numenius really as an allegorist and commentator on the Bible. We don't hear anything really of the metaphysics of Numenius in Origen. Proclus, of course, does refer to Numenius occasionally, but never quotes him, and doesn't always entirely coincide with what Eusebius tells us. And we have a similar problem with Atticus in that respect. So, I mean, reconstructing Numenius often involves the synthesis of sources that perhaps are not entirely convergent. What there does seem to be evidence of is some kind of Numenian tradition, because as I say, Aemilius is said by Porphyry himself to be a great aficionado of Numenius, and Porphyry in the Cave of the Nymphs is certainly quite happy to quote Numenius, and was clearly regarded by other people as an aficionado. So Numenius is being read and used by at least two of the pupils of Plotinus. Porphyry, on the other hand, wishes to play down the influence of Numenius on Plotinus himself, and of course Plotinus doesn't refer to Numenius by name, but then he doesn't refer to that many people by name. There is a tantalizing reference in John Lydus to Numenius of Rome, which might be a different person, or it might indicate, as Desplaces presumably assumes, that Numenius of Apamea was also Numenius of Rome, in which case he might have taught in Rome. And then one might wonder, well, what relation might there be between the circle of Plotinus in Rome and any previous school of Numenius? But that's obviously wildly speculative, and there is in fact quite a big chronological gap between the two. So I think that's all I could say. I don't know whether you would like to say anything on your own account. No.
Okay, thank you.
Professor Hellman?
Yes, thanks so much for a very clear talk on an awful lot of material. I guess my question was a surprise about your reference to the Logos in 291 as potentially the Christian Logos. And I guess I would like to maybe elaborate a little bit more on why that might have been, or whether perhaps it's much more likely a Stoic Logos, or maybe even Philo in the background here. Philo of Alexandria.
Yes, I think my point was that it seems as if Plotinus is aware of someone who might posit Logos as a further hypostasis. Now, Christians by this period certainly use the term hypostasis, and they also at least Origen, thinks of the Logos as the second hypostasis. So it would be, among the people who might have posited Logos as one of the hypostases would be Christians.
Okay.
If we think of Stoics, well, the trouble is, Stoics wouldn't presumably include Logos among other hypostases. I mean, they wouldn't have this theory of multiple hypostases at all, as far as I know. Philo, of course, uses the term Logos along with Holy Spirit and wisdom and demiurge and all kinds of terms, and scholars argue as to how many of these terms are identical. Then we'd have to raise a question, I suppose, how likely is it that Plotinus was acquainted with Philo? Whitaker would argue that Numenius was acquainted with Philo. I think Porphyry is. It's certainly not impossible that Philo was being read by non-Christian Platonists. But I don't know that we have, I mean, it seems to me there's probably more evidence of, more likelihood of Plotinus bumping into Christians in Rome than there is bumping into disciples of Philo. But, all we can say, I think, is that he has somebody he knows is positing Logos as an extra hypostasis. And presumably these people calling themselves Gnostics are the ones who are doing it.
Interesting. So it is the term hypostasis. And I guess my question is, at what point this became current for Christians? But I guess we have Origen in the 3rd century and...
Yeah. I mean, Origen is, as I say, markedly older than Plotinus. So, the notion of 3 hypostases is there already in the commentary on John.
All right, thank you.
Padre Lee?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I have 2 comments on your note on, or 2 questions on your note on your last note on Porphyry.
Mm-hmm.
The thing, I mean, the tetrad of virtues, I mean, the 4 virtues.
Mm-hmm.
We do have these 4 virtues in fragments 46 and 47 in the Chaldean oracles. I mean, in 46 we have, I mean, the 3, and then comes the LPs, so it's a matter of reconstructing the fragments. But I mean, do we really know, I mean, the exact date of the Gospel of Philip? I mean, I can see very well that, I can surmise that the Chaldean oracles could have been, I mean, the source for Porphyry in that case. And the second comment would concern, I mean, what you said about that Porphyry was the first to use the phrase 3 hypostases, and this somehow reveal, I mean, that that he had some Christian background or something like that. But the thing is that we usually forget, we do not quote, we do not cite the title of 5.1 as it is, and where the archikos is really important. So that's on the 3 primary hypostases, which I take, which means that there are further hypostases. Mm-hmm. The 4th hypostasis, which would be, I mean, what we have in the 4th hypothesis of the Parmenides, that is the enmatted form. The 5th hypostasis could be what we have in the 5th hypothesis of the Parmenides, according to the Neoplatonic interpretation, which would be the matter. So the thing is that, well, Porphyry speaks about the 3 primary hypostases because there are some other hypostases that come next. And this is, I think, is totally relevant to the way Christians use the term hypostasis. And then we should not forget that this whole thing, I mean, what is a hypostasis for a Christian? A hypostasis for a Christian is the 3 persons of the Trinity, of course. And this is, I mean, some years after Porphyry. That's the Second Ecumenical Council. That's 381, the 3 hypostases. And hypostasis, of course, is Paul and Peter, which is a standard example, I mean, in John Damascene's Dialectica. And I wouldn't say that, well, hypostasis in that context really has, I mean, the same meaning as in the title of 5.1. So, yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Yes. Obviously, if we can attribute the tetrad to the Chaldean oracles, it will be earlier than Porphyry. As regards the Gospel of Philip, I mean, we don't have a text of the Gospel of Philip that is, we don't have a manuscript that is older than the mid-4th century. So obviously we can't be absolutely certain that the Gospel of Philip existed before Porphyry. I don't think there are any attestations of it in early Christian literature. I think it quite likely that the texts of the young codex, the first codex from Nag Hammadi, are fairly early. But there's no, as I say, there's no way of proving for certain that they're earlier than the 4th century. I would say I think the Apocryphon of John has to be 2nd century because of Irenaeus, and the Gospel of Thomas, I think, represents quite an early form of the Christian sayings tradition. So those texts certainly seem to me, to be 2nd century or earlier. But of course, we can't assume that everything from Nag Hammadi is as early as that, just because they are. So I agree that I certainly can't prove that the Gospel of Philip is earlier than Porphyry, but at least it's interesting that that tetrad occurs in both of them. Yes, thank you for what you say about hypostases, which of course is true, that it is archicone. That might, I don't know whether that necessarily weakens the idea that Porphyry had Christian nomenclature in mind. And of course, the word archicone might be seen even as a kind of corrective, if you like, to the Christian expression. As I say, Origen and indeed Arius certainly used 3 hypostases before 381. Arius, of course, is later than Porphyry, but Origen is earlier. So, I mean, Porphyry could be familiar with the expression 3 hypostases in the Godhead. Again, one can't prove it. I think the expression God above all in the Life of Plotinus is more interesting, as indicating the possibility of appropriation of Christian nomenclature.
Thank you.
So are there any further questions or remarks or?
Well, we could always hear about Zeke Mazer from William Altman.
Excellent. Okay, so he's talking about chapter 16 of 2.9. And he's pointing out that the theory of imitation that Plotinus seems to ascribe to is not consistent with what Plato himself says in Republic 10. In other words, that it seems to be a much more positive relationship between the image and its exemplar. And first of all, he said something that's very interesting. I found it almost the best defense of Longinus's view, if we can believe that Simplicia. I think maybe it's Proclus, where kind of Longinus makes the demiurge prior to the exemplars he looks to. And I don't know if in any way Mazer is correct in what he says at first, but I'm going to read you the passage and see if I can get your reaction. So this is the Longinus-friendly thing. In Book 10 of the Republic, however, the implication is rather that the supreme principle, the good, actually generates the paradigmatic forms. So that's the Longinus-friendly thing. That's not really what I want to ask you about, but I thought it was interesting. This latter principle is not implicated in the mimetic process. Rather, as we have seen, Plato sets the natural creative activity of the good in specific contradistinction to the laborious mimetic activity of the human artist. Indeed, this occurs in the context of his most scathing assault on artistic and poetic mimesis. It is thus evident that Plato accords a significantly different role to the form-creating good of the Republic than he does to the matter-molding demiurge of the Timaeus. Now, here's the interesting part, Mark. Now, unlike pre-Plotinian academic Platonists, whose harmonizing agenda led them to minimize or gloss over the discrepancy between seemingly conflicting dialogues, various Platonizing Gnostics seem to have read Timaeus and Republic together, or rather against one another, to emphasize the vast separation between the true ineffable God on the one hand and the mediocre, if not actively malevolent demiurge on the other. What most have particularly caught their attention is the resemblance of the specifically mimetic activity of the demiurge of the Timaeus to that of the disparaged human artist and craftsman of the Republic, whom, it should be noted, Plato similarly calls demiurgos, e.g. at 596 B6. Close quote. So I just thought that was a fascinating observation, and I wonder what your reaction to it is.
Yes, I think so. I mean, we have to assume, I take it, that the use of the term demiurge by the Gnostics has Platonic roots. But then, of course, the oddity is that they seem to be depreciating the work of the demiurge. So I think the argument that they are reading the Timaeus against the Republic certainly makes sense. I think there may also be something from the Old Testament here. I mean, demiurgos is used in the Septuagint for a maker of idols. And so, there's not only a Platonic denunciation of imitation, there's also a biblical one. And I think, that one could say, if one says, well, why does Sophia fall? What is actually being represented here? I think probably something like St. Paul's idea of the wisdom of the world being at odds with the wisdom of God lies behind the Gnostic notion of the fall of Sophia. So I think certainly this polarization of the Timaeus and the Republic is important, but I think it probably also has to be wedded to a particular use of biblical themes to explain how the Gnostic position arises.
Just to thank you so much for the biblical root. I mean, they couldn't have been as opposed to the demiurge as they were unless they were aware of the Timaeus, it seems to me. I mean, I don't think we should worry that point. Although I think your other points about the Septuagint point is brilliant. Thank you so much for that, and also the wisdom of the world. I mean, because Plotinus really is defending the wisdom of the world, or rather, the world as a product of wisdom. So thank you very much for that, Professor Edwards.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or anyone who would like to step in?
Oh, that's fine.
So if there are no more questions, then let us thank Mark, Professor Edwards, once again for this great talk, and renew our appointment for the 3rd of May, when Professor Sternzile is going to talk on Amartia in Plotinus. Mark, thank you very much again, and thank you all for being here and for the great discussion.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Rini. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.